Thutmoses' gamble pays off, or at least he claims it does, and suddenly the Egyptians just appear, basically, in front of the plains of Megiddo.
Welcome to the History Extra Podcast. Fascinating historical conversations from the makers of BBC History Magazine. The Battle of Megiddo is one of the most important clashes you've probably never heard of. But when an army led by Pharaoh Thutmosis III clashed with a coalition of enemy forces some 35 centuries ago, Egypt's status as a regional superpower was on the line. But luckily for the Egyptians, Thutmosis had a few surprises up his sleeve. Historian Nicky Nielsen tells Spencer Mizen more.
Thank you very much for joining us today. So, you wrote a feature on the Battle of Megiddo for the April 2024 issue of BBC History Magazine. Yeah. Now, within that article, you described the Battle of Megiddo, which was fought 35 centuries ago, is one of the most important of the late Bronze Age. Now, given that, I wonder if you could describe this ancient clash to our listeners and tell them between whom it was fought and who emerged victorious.
Right, so the battle in broad terms is fought between the Egyptian army under Thutmosis III on one side and a coalition of Canaanite troops on the other side, led by the rulers of Megiddo and of another city called Kadesh. In reality, it seems to be a bit of a coalition, a mixture of different troops from across the ancient Near East who are facing off against the Egyptians. And this is really a reflection of the political reality across the ancient Near East at the time. So you have a number of relatively centralized states, so places like Egypt and Mitanni, later on Hatti, the Hittite Empire, Assyria, and Babylon. The rulers of those larger states are part of a sort of network of brothers, it's referred to as later. They tend to refer to each other as brothers. And in between their territory are a series of smaller states, so smaller kingdoms and principalities and so on. And we tend to refer to all the rulers in that area as vassals, which is a bit of a simplification, but it is the case that these city-states and smaller territories, they are forever shifting their allegiances backwards and forwards between the great powers, essentially. At this time, they are aligned. Megiddo is aligned to Egypt before the battle. But really, every time there's any kind of political change in Egypt or in any of the other great powers, the alliances are shifted around, and that's really what happens there. So Thutmosis is not a new ruler when he comes to the throne, not really, because he's actually been a co-ruler for a very long time with his stepmother Hatshepsut, and she's put him in charge of the army. So he's had very much a military upbringing. He's not an inexperienced young man who comes to the throne. He's already very, very well versed in both power and military. Often what will happen is that if there is some kind of shifting of alliances or political upset, something like that, it will happen when a new king takes over. And that's because the new king's enemies or potential enemies, wants to test them, basically. They want to see how is this new king going to react. And that's pretty much what happens before the Battle of Megiddo. Thutmosis becomes the sole ruler because Hatshepsut dies. Shortly thereafter, the ruler of Kadesh moves his troops to Megiddo and allies with the ruler of Megiddo, essentially trying to draw a line in the sand and see what's the Egyptians going to do. What is this new king going to do, and how's he going to react? I would argue it's a miscalculation because they're treating Thutmosis as if he was, completely green. And he isn't. So he reacts by gathering a fairly sizable Egyptian army and then heading straight off to Megiddo to essentially retake the territory and, in a way, I suppose, demonstrate to all the other vassals across the Near East that, yes, he is powerful, yes, he is in charge, no, they shouldn't think about shifting their alliances because then he'll come come after them, basically. So that's the kind of political backdrop to the battle.
So is there an element there that some of these vassal states have possibly underestimating Thutmosis, and they think they can really take advantage of Egypt when it seems like it might potentially be at a moment of weakness?
I mean, it's difficult to say, isn't it? Because we don't what we lack from this time period, from the late Bronze Age, that we have for later periods of history, is really any kind of what we would classify as historical writing. There aren't really historians going around writing or trying to write objective descriptions. What we have from Megiddo, for instance, is largely the Egyptian side of the story, and it's a very triumphalist and a very propagandistic piece of writing. So we have to run everything through this internal filter of basically it's exclusively the Egyptian king who's telling the story later on, and it's being told for the purposes of being put in a temple and showing how great the king is to the gods. It's not being written for future historians. We are not the intended audience. So we have to kind of bear that in mind when we're dealing with battles at this time. So it's difficult to say too much about motivations, because according to the Egyptian texts, this is all happening because the Prince of Kadesh is, a traitor, is despicable, all of these sort of they're rebels. Everyone who fights against Pharaoh is a rebel by its very definition. So the Egyptians are not really doing a very balanced history writing here at all. It's possible that they are simply reacting in a way that's pretty normal when there is a change in power. The downside, or one of the quite many downsides of having a kind of totalitarian leadership, as Egypt is basically a dictatorship, is that when the new ruler comes along, there is probably going to be a period of shifting, a period of all the courtiers trying to position themselves under the new ruler. There might even be attempts at palace coups. There might be people trying to get their own candidate in there. So it's a period of time where traditionally things have been a little bit unsettled. So maybe they're simply hoping that the situation in Egypt is so unsettled that the Egyptians don't have the kind of bandwidth to react to this provocation. But it is difficult to say. It could also be that they're thinking, well, yeah, okay, he's been a co-ruler, but really Hatshepsut has been the actual power. So how much experience does he really have? They might also be thinking along those lines.
So what happens when the two sides meet in battle? Because Thutmosis pulls something of a rabbit out of a hat, doesn't he? And really surprises his opponents. Can you talk us through that, please?
Yeah, he, according to himself, of course, and this is all according, the world according to Thutmosis. So the combined Canaanite forces essentially split into three. They position the main bulk of their force in front of the city of Megiddo. There are three paths, three ways into the city of Megiddo, the Jezreel Valley. And there's basically a northern path and a southern path, which are the well-traveled ways, the well-traveled roads. That is the road that an army on campaign would take, because an army on campaign, the Egyptians, we're talking thousands and thousands of troops, a lot of infrastructure to go with that army, food and so on, transporting water. So that's the sensible route, basically, that a commander would take. So the Canaanites split their forces and put a force at the head of the northern path and a force at the head of the southern path, and then the remainder of the army in front of the city. And Thutmosis halts before essentially picking a path, and according to him, he has a kind of meeting with all of his commanders, all of his officers, and this meeting is preserved in a format which we call a Königsnovelle, so a king's novel, essentially. And it's a type of literature that's become popular by the early New Kingdom, so around the time of Thutmosis III, and it's basically a dialogue. It's a dialogue between the king and his courtiers, or the king and his commanders, and usually they all take the same form. And that makes us a little bit suspicious that this is maybe not exactly a reflection of what's happening. This is a piece of literature, a sort of fictionalized account of what's happened. But basically, the king's courtiers or generals will always suggest the most cowardly way forward, the most inactive, inefficient, useless way forward, because that then allows the king to appear as a hero and basically overrule his cowardly generals and say, no, we're going to do this, this, and this. I'm going to be bold, whether that's really what's happening in reality, or whether Thutmoses' generals are actually the ones that are taking the decision, who knows. But in this case, the generals all say, oh, we should take either the southern or the northern road, because there is another road in the middle called the Aruna Pass, but it's far too narrow. It's dangerous. It's very, it's hemmed in with cliffs on either side. You can really only walk through it single file. It's a place that just begs for an ambush, basically. And that's far too dangerous. We can't consider that. And Thutmoses, of course, says, no, we will take this dangerous road because it's the most direct path to the city. So he overrules his generals and they march through the Aruna Pass, which is genuinely a pretty dangerous road. It's rocky, there's no real path. The Egyptian charioteers would have had to disassemble their chariots, they would have had to be carried, the horses would have had to be led through, everyone is passing by, single file or maybe two abreast, something like that. It could have gone very differently if the Canaanite troops had thought that this was a real possibility and positioned ambushes all the way through the Aruna Pass, because then the Egyptians may never have made it through and into Megiddo. But Thutmoses' gamble pays off, or at least he claims it does, and suddenly the Egyptians just appear, basically, in front of the plains of Megiddo. The Canaanite army is completely unprepared for that. They've been waiting for reports from their scouts, either from the north or the south, to report when the Egyptians are coming along these well-traveled roads, and then presumably the plan was to tire the Egyptians out with kind of running battles until they reach the plains in front of Megiddo. Thutmoses has really thrown that plan out the window because he's now there. It does take the Egyptian army several hours to get into position. The Aruna Pass being as narrow as it is means that the army can't just kind of spill out. It has to come out slowly. And that's really where things go a bit sideways for the Egyptians, because the Canaanite force is trapped between the city of Megiddo itself, the walls of Megiddo, and the Egyptian army. That's where they have their camp. But as soon as the Egyptians get into position, the Canaanite force basically flees, and they run back towards the city after a brief skirmish, and the gates are opened of the city to allow the Canaanite soldiers to run inside, the soldiers of Megiddo and Kadesh. And Thutmoses obviously orders his men to pursue them, and there's a chance here that they can actually both defeat the army and take the city of Megiddo all in one kind of fell swoop. And he loses control of his army, basically, because the soldiers take one look at the Canaanite encampment and decide that they'd much rather loot that than they would, run after the fleeing enemy. So they basically divert, and for probably several hours, Thutmoses and his commanders do not have control of their own army, which allows both the enemy commanders and most of their force to withdraw into Megiddo, in some cases, apparently, according to the Egyptians, only by the citizens of Megiddo actually throwing down ropes and ladders from the walls so the soldiers can clamber up them, while the Egyptian troops are distracted plundering the camp. So while the setup to the battle is quite successful from Thutmoses' point of view, the actual execution of it is pretty terrible in terms of discipline, because now instead of a swift victory, which no doubt he wanted, he's stuck with a month-long siege.
Okay, what did siege warfare look like in the 15th century BC? I mean, is it similar to how we imagine a medieval siege?
No, not at all, because you don't have most of those war engines in the late Bronze Age. There are no catapults, there are no trebuchets. There are siege towers. We have depictions of siege towers from Egyptian tomb reliefs. They don't seem to be very big. There are some kind of rams as well, but they seem to be targeting the walls rather than targeting the gates. And that may be something to do with the actual architecture at the time, because walls at the time are built from mud brick, unfired mud brick. Very, very thick. Some of the Egyptian fortress walls are, 5, 6, 7 meters thick. They are bulky things. But they also have a bit of give. They're a bit soft almost. So the best way to undermine them, often we see Egyptian soldiers in depictions using mattocks and hoes, basically almost like mining through the walls because they're fairly soft. So you can kind of undercut them until the walls collapse. That's obviously pretty dangerous because you have to be right next to the wall, and that opens you up to archery fire from above. And some of the Egyptian bodies of soldiers that we have, like the Tomb of the Archers at Deir el-Bahri, the soldiers there who were probably killed in sieges, they have suffered mainly from head injuries, wounds to the stones and arrows to the top of the head because someone is firing straight down at them while they're trying to undermine the walls. So it's not really desirable to have a siege in the late Bronze Age. And what Thutmosis does is, I think, what most commanders do at the time, if they have the resources, rather than try to assault the walls, they basically cut off the city and starve it out.
And obviously that worked eventually. How long did the siege last for?
About 7 months. So I'm sure that Thutmosis was not best pleased with his soldiers because of that. How
did it come to an end? I mean, was it basically starvation was rife in Megiddo and their leaders came out and surrendered?
Essentially, yes. The city, the ruler of Kadesh manages to slip away, much to the annoyance, no doubt, of the Egyptians. But the city, eventually runs low on supplies, and the nobles of Megiddo come out, and in this, again, according to the Egyptians, in this very almost kind of formulaic expression of surrender, they crawl on their bellies to Thutmosis and kiss the ground in front of the king, promise never to do something like that again, and then also give him a sizable payoff of weapons, horses, cattle, gold, all this kind of stuff that Thutmosis then takes back to Egypt, and then he can use that to enrich the cult of Amun-Ra at Karnak. So essentially, he's paid off to go away.
Now, before exploring what happened next, I wonder if we could have a quick chat about ancient Egypt in the 15th century BC. I just quite like to place it for our listeners. I mean, obviously, ancient Egypt lasted for a very, very long time, thousands of years. Where did it stand when Thutmosis came to power? Where chronologically, where does he sit in relation to, say, Tutankhamun or Ramesses II?
So he's a little bit before Tutankhamun, not too much, not too many reigns before Tutankhamun, so 150 years or so, and a couple of 100 years, 250, 300 years before Ramesses II. So he is within the New Kingdom, this period that contains both Tutankhamun and Ramesses II, and also Amenhotep III, another great Egyptian king. So what has happened is Egypt has, during what we refer to as the Second Intermediate Period, which comes before the New Kingdom, Egypt has been effectively ruled in part by the Hyksos. So the Hyksos are Canaanite mercenaries that initially the Egyptians had actually hired during the Middle Kingdom, but when there is a power vacuum in the Egyptian state, the Hyksos rulers basically start taking power in Egypt. So Thutmosis's ancestors are the royal dynasty of Thebes, who essentially base their power on the fact that they kicked the Hyksos out and unified Egypt under a single Egyptian pharaoh again. And because of that, I guess, very martial origin of the New Kingdom, the role of the king has changed a little bit. So the king of the New Kingdom, much more than the king of the Middle Kingdom or the Old Kingdom, the Pyramid Age, has to be a hero. And that really fits with what's going on in the Late Bronze Age more widely. I mean, this is the time of the Iliad, really, and the Odyssey. This is the time of the great heroes. And the Egyptian ruler has to be a war leader as well as a political leader. So you have to lead campaigns, and even if you don't, you have to show that you're leading campaigns in your decoration, in your iconography. Hatshepsut, Thutmoses' predecessor, she hasn't led so many military campaigns, but she has sent this very famous expedition to Punt, the land of Punt, which is probably somewhere in Somalia, to bring back incense for Amun-Ra, which is similar in a sense, organizing these kind of foreign expeditions. The king that succeeds Thutmoses, Amenhotep II, he takes this idea of the heroic king almost to extremes. He is, well, he's called the sporty king. He goes on and on in his inscriptions about how good he is at fighting, what a great horseman he is. He claims that he can shoot an arrow with enough force to go through a bronze plate and continue flying on the other side. He claims that only he can string his bow, which is a lovely, a little bit of an echo of the Odyssey there, that only the king can string his bow, no other man in the army. So obviously he takes it to extremes, but this idea of the king as a heroic fighter is something that's quite important during the New Kingdom, and it's something that Thutmoses very much lives up to.
Great stuff. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of the interview, you described the Battle of Megiddo as one of the most important of the late Bronze Age. You also point out that Thutmoses has subsequently been described as the Napoleon of ancient Egypt. So I've got kind of a two-pronged question here. Why was Megiddo such an important battle? And why is Thutmoses known as the Napoleon of ancient Egypt?
Well, Megiddo is important because it establishes Thutmoses' sole rule, and it kind of sets the tone. If Megiddo had been an abject failure, his rule, first of all, might have been quite short because he was with the army, so that, he may actually not have survived. But also, it really sets the tone for the rest of his reign. He goes on multiple campaigns, more than a dozen, into the Near East. It's like an annual thing, and that's Egyptian kings of the New Kingdom do go on military campaigns, but not to that extent. And I think that's why he's earned that nickname, because he really does go on a lot of military campaigns. He spends a lot of his life in the field, basically, rather than in the palace. Megiddo is important as well because we know something about it. It's always important to underscore that in a lot of cases there were probably lots more battles in the late Bronze Age that we don't know about because they were not written down, because they weren't written down in sufficient detail, because they weren't preserved for whatever reason. Many of Thutmoses' subsequent campaigns are preserved in what's called the Annals of Thutmoses, which are basically long inscriptions that were originally put up in the Karnak temple. They were actually taken down by later rulers and used as foundation filler. So, they only survived because they were broken up and used as foundation material. So, who knows how many more battle campaigns and descriptions have been lost over the years. So Megiddo, I think, is important because we know a fair amount about it and we have a fair amount of detail about it, and we're not reliant exclusively on very brief mentions or very brief descriptions. What we do have is, as I said, very heavily propagandistic, but at least it's something.
And does it turn ancient Egypt into a superpower, or would you argue that it already was a superpower by then?
I think Egypt was certainly on the way. Egypt had subdued its nearest competitor, which was the Kingdom of Kush in modern-day Sudan. They had already been defeated. Egypt had begun to create a buffer zone, basically, in the Near East, where there were a series of states and city-states and so on that were loyal to Egypt, and where the Egyptians could station troops, these vassals. They had begun to establish those. Thutmoses helped that very much so. But but the situation was so fluid that I don't think it's necessarily a case of Egypt becoming a superpower. It's more a case of Egypt retaining that status, because it could be lost very easily. One ineffective king and the whole vassal system collapses, basically. So Egypt's power could fluctuate quite a lot depending on who was on the throne. Amenhotep II, Thutmose' successor, conducts more military campaigns in the Near East and subjugates more city-states. But arguably, the king of the New Kingdom, who actually had perhaps the greatest impact on Egypt's international standing, was actually Amenhotep III, who conducted almost no military operations, and instead used diplomacy. And in particular diplomatic marriages. He actually made Egypt extremely powerful simply by marrying an almost unbelievable amount of non-Egyptian princesses and maintaining a series of diplomatic relations which were based largely on gift-giving and giving a lot of Egyptian gold to various kings. But he actually made Egypt even more powerful, not through military, but through very, very careful diplomacy.
Now, where would you say that Thutmose ranks in the pantheon of great pharaohs? I mean, and why isn't he better known? Why does the name of Ramesses II always come to mind a lot quicker?
I think the name of Ramesses comes to mind because of Ramesses. First of all, he reigned for an unbelievably long time. He was on the throne for more than 60 years, which in the late Bronze Age is impressive that he made it to that grand old age. That gave him a lot of time to build monuments. And this is how we know Egyptian kings, basically, is by their monuments. There is almost no site in Egypt, archaeological site, that Ramesses has not been, involved with in some way. But he went further than that. He also went back and carved out the names of earlier rulers like Thutmose III and Amenhotep III and put his own name there instead, essentially trying to take credit for their construction. So Ramesses is well known because he was on the throne for so long. He's such a kind of heavy weight on the historical landscape. Tutankhamun is well known because of his tomb and because of his treasure. Without that, I doubt he'd be known by more than a handful of Egyptologists. He did re-establish the traditional faith of ancient Egypt after the Artanist interregnum, but I don't think he would be particularly well known if it wasn't for his great golden treasure. So kings are not just known for what they do, but also for what happens subsequently.
Researching this topic, is there anything that really sticks in your mind that really surprised you? A fact, something you came across while researching the Battle of Megiddo, you think, wow, that really took me back?
Actually, looking at pictures of the Aruna Pass, I've never actually visited there, and realizing just how incredibly dangerous it would have been. I've obviously seen kind of maps and when you research any kind of military history, it's easy to just see lines on a map and arrows that go in certain directions. And then you look at video footage or photos, or you go to the actual locations and look around and go, oh, wow. And I very much had that kind of moment with the Aruna Pass, thinking, this is mad. This is genuinely mad. If this actually happened and this isn't all just bragging by Thutmose, that was either madness or genius, but a very fine line between the two.